Wonderful. All right. Welcome, everybody. I am Alan Rippin. I'm the Center for Active Living Director at the Athens Community Council on Aging. I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad, Cloud, you're here. So this is the first in a three-part series on the changes that dementia brings. I did want to just say this is part of a larger event that's going on in Athens this month, sponsored by the National Endowment of the Arts Big Read program. And they've selected the book, we've selected the book, Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant? I'm not sure if everyone's heard of this book, but it's by the New Yorker cartoonist Roz Chats, and it's a graphic memoir. It's a really powerful graphic memoir talking about her experience caring for her parents as they were getting older and at the end of life. And I highly recommend reading this. It's a really interesting use of graphic memoir as the medium. But anyway, so it's the inspiration for our talk and for our series that we're hosting at ACCA on essential resources for those who are caring for loved ones with dementia or just going through life with these challenges and needing some additional help and support. So that's the inspiration for us today and for the month-long series. We are delighted, I should say, if anyone would like a copy of the book who's on the call today, I do have a few extra copies available, so just let me know. All right, so Conrad's here with us. We're delighted. Let me just tell you a little bit about her. Cloud is a dementia caregiver training specialist. She has numerous certifications, including certification as an independent caregiver trainer with TIPA Snow, and she's a life coach certified by the International Coach Federation, I should say. She's also an Alzheimer's Association community educator. I know she's worked a lot with ACCA before in that capacity, and is herself a two-time family dementia caregiver. So she brings a lot of personal and professional experience to this, and honestly, the perfect person to help us navigate these waters today. So thank you. I also want to mention she did just publish a new book, a caregiver manual called The Dementia Field Guide. I know she wants to show that and talk about that as well, which is probably
gonna need that.
Probably a fantastic resource. I'm sure it's a fantastic resource for everyone. So anyway, we're just delighted to have you here, and thank you. And you'll be here again in June and July, but we'll get started today. So I'm going to pass it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan. It's such a privilege to be here today. As Alan mentioned, we're going to be exploring dementia and the changes that it brings. Today's topic is assessing the topography of cognitive thinking, and I'm excited to jump in and share that with you. The session in June will be charting the course, a dementia caregiver's primer, and the session in July will be navigating unfamiliar terrain, how to overcome dementia's symptom-related behaviors. And now I'm going to share my screen so we can jump right in. Hopefully you are seeing, Alan, can you give me the thumbs up if you see exploring dementia? Excellent, okay. And I'm sorry for the hum in the background. Something that's just started in my house this morning. I don't know what it is, haven't identified it yet, but hopefully I can talk over it. Where we're going today, I would like to go over the topics that we'll cover before we dig in. So the first thing that we'll talk about is what is normal aging. Then we will talk about why cognitive impairment is hard to discern early on. Then this will be the bulk of our presentation today, signals of cognitive impairment and how you can recognize them. We'll talk a little bit about how to use the DIY assessment that I have provided to you for free. It's a Survey Monkey. It's actually built as a survey. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we get to that moment. We will talk a lot about establishing a cognitive baseline and why that's important. And then finally, a little bit about seeking medical advice if the signals that I talk about today are something that you've observed in yourself or a family member or a friend. So first, what is normal aging? We all show signs of age as we progress in years, and a lot of that is really normal. If we think about peak working memory, for most cognitive skills, we experience peak working memory somewhere in our 20s and 30s, and thereafter it's downhill, but at a very, 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 very slow rate. And many cognitive skills we have in spades up until our 50s, 60s, 70s. As we are graying, as our hair is graying, as our skin begins to wrinkle, we become a little bit forgetful. And that might show up as occasional word loss, or losing one's train of thought, or not being able to come up with someone's name. It may show up as a little bit of moodiness. We all tend to get a little bit set in our ways as we age, and so when something changes to the status quo, it can upset us a little bit, and we're a little moody. As we age, we tend to withdraw a little bit from social engagement. In our 20s and 30s, we did a lot of dining out. We had friends over very often. In our 40s and 50s, that slows down a little bit. And then in our 60s and 70s, it normally slows down a little bit more. Much of that is attributed to the fact that we are more comfortable with ourselves, and also we tire a little more easily. So social engagement is something we kind of have to rest up for. We might also notice a loss in muscle strength as we age. That's very normal. We might also notice a decrease in our fine motor skills or our manual dexterity. And also we might need bifocals or readers. We might need a hearing aid in order to hear as we once did. That's all normal aging. But what is not normal is when the changes that I'm about to describe show up that are consistently different for that person and different from before. Changes that interfere with daily living, and a lapse from which a person cannot recover. So it's not a senior moment. If, for example, if I am at the grocery store and I see at the other end of the aisle the teacher that was my daughter's favorite teacher in high school, and we have a little conversation, and I cannot remember her name. I'm thinking to myself, what is her name? What is her name? What is her name? And in the car driving home from the grocery store, I realized, her name is Jane. Why couldn't I remember that in the moment? That's a senior moment, because I was able to recover from that. I eventually got Jane's name back into my head. Why is cognitive impairment so hard to discern early on? If cognitive impairment is indeed in play, it is typically happening so slowly, and the changes are so gradual, and the early signs look like normal aging, that I might reconstruct a new normal. I don't know if you've heard the expression boiling a toad. So the saying goes that if you put a toad in a pot of water, you put the water on the stove, and you cut on the burner, the toad will not jump out of the water because it's gradually becoming accustomed to the increase in temperature. As opposed to, if you put the toad in a pot of boiling water, it would jump right out because it would know this is a threat to me. It would recognize the change in temperature, and it would jump out to protect its to self-preserve, frankly. So these changes are so slow that loved ones typically start to think of a new normal for that person. Also, the brain can compensate in other ways. And if a person is aware that they're having changes in their cognitive thinking skills, they oftentimes are able to cover those up so that others around them won't notice them. And then and we also tend to think, well, I forget appointments sometimes too, so I'm normal, so therefore my sister or my mother, or my spouse is normal as well. That's just normal aging. And then finally, dementia is really a very daunting topic, particularly at first on the outside looking in, and so denial is commonly in play. Now, for the bulk of our conversation today, I'm going to talk about the signals of cognitive impairment. And I'm going to talk about them. I actually want to focus on 30 signals of cognitive impairment, which may sound like a long number, but they're really divided into groups. I'm going to talk about 8 different kinds of cognitive skills that we all have, and then I'll go into detail about what changes would look like if cognitive impairment was in play. And I'm going to use a visual to help support the words that I'm talking about. So these are actually illustrations of some brain scans that are done with positron emission tomography, or PET scans as you might hear them called. And that's a big word. or a big phrase, but if you've never heard of that before, I want to just stress that positron emission tomography measures brain activity. And so when we look at these images, I'd like for you to think about a weather map, like if you're looking at the back page of USA Today. And it's kind of talking about the temperatures around the country, and you'll see that the hottest areas of the country are marked or shaded in red, and then the next hottest areas are shaded in orange, and then the next cooler is orange, and then cooler from that is going to be yellow, and then green and blue, and just like the colors of the spectrum. So in a PET scan, a positron emissions tomography scan, the areas of the brain that are most active will show as red. And I use this comparatively. On the left, I can't see if you can, let me use my annotation tool. Well, let's just use the mouse. In this image on the left, you can see that there's quite a bit of red area shaded in here as compared to the slide in the middle, which is the image in the middle, which represents the scan of a person in the early stages of Alzheimer's. And also much more red there and warm colors there than we see in the late stage scan, where there's quite a bit of blue and purple, indicating low level of activity. So the illustration on the left is a healthy brain with full cognitive skill, and in the center there's some cognitive impairment going on, and in the right hand image is late stage Alzheimer's, where, and this relates to all dementia really, where you see very little brain activity happening, meaning in the case of Alzheimer's and other dementia, the brain cells die, the dementia causes brain cells to die, and that affects the network connectivity between the neurons, the synapses, and as they die and the brain atrophies, then we're going to see a lot less brain activity. The first area that I want to talk about is visual processing, and this takes place in the occipital lobe, which is actually in the back of our head. So I'm going to turn around and show you, basically, my hand is covering my occipital lobe. It's interesting, we think that we see with our eyes, but that's not in fact the case. We take in data, and we take in visual data with our eyes, but we actually see in the back of the brain, in the occipital lobe. That's where we detect form and color and motion and light and shadow and reflection. It's also where we detect depth, and related to that, the occipital lobe governs our peripheral vision. So if you want to do a little test right now, you can hold your arms out at the sides. See, my arms are at about 180 degrees, and I'm going to wiggle my fingers. Well, I cannot see, I'm turning 60 next month, I cannot see my fingers if my hands are 180 degrees apart. I have to move in slightly so that I can see my fingers wiggling. Some of this is normal. In fact, a person who is aging normally at the age of 75 will have about 90 degrees or 100 degrees of their peripheral vision. It's normal that we lose some peripheral vision. So I'm making an L with my arms right now. That's normal for a 75-year-old. However, if a person has cognitive impairment, the dementia will damage the occipital lobe to the extent that their peripheral vision gradually constricts until they eventually, it's as if they are wearing a monocle. And if you cover one eye, you'll notice that you can't see anything but what's directly in front of you. You can't see down without looking, you can't see up without looking. But you'll also notice that you're missing a piece of your depth perception. So the peripheral vision and the ability to detect depth are interrelated. Now, on the left-hand side of the screen, I've got the same list that I showed you before. This is the normal cognitive skill, and I want to contrast that with the list that's on the right-hand side under the heading Cognitive Decline. And you'll notice that I've drawn a red rectangle around the area of the brain that we're talking about, so it's easy for you to compare the active occipital lobe in the normal brain on the left, the healthy brain on the left, versus the amount of red that's in the center, and then progressively on the right in our diagram here, representing in the center early stage Alzheimer's, and on the right late stage Alzheimer's. So how does this show up? We know what it looks like on the brain, even though we can't see the occipital lobe from the outside. But whereas before one could detect form and color and motion, if the occipital lobe is impaired by dementia, it's going to cause a lack of object and facial recognition. Objects will hide in plain sight because we can't distinguish them from the background. Often that's either a depth problem or a problem separating the color of the object from the color of, say, the table behind it. We're also going to notice some motion blindness. I'm not able to detect the motion around me as I once would, which could create some problems with driving. Also, objects hiding in plain sight could create some problems in driving. We might notice some eye trickery or hallucinations, and these commonly have to do with the fact that if one has cognitive impairment, one won't necessarily understand reflection for what it is. So if I see my reflection in the mirror, I might not recognize, who is that strange person? Or if I see my reflection in a glass, like a big plate window, I might believe that there's a stranger on the other side of the glass. I won't be able to detect that that's my reflection in that glass. And so that can create some either eye trickery or even hallucinations. Also, we talked about the depth problems affected by peripheral vision. And so one would become depth challenged, which is also going to be a problem in driving. It may show up as some clumsiness. I might think that my glass of water is 4 inches further away from me than it is, and I may knock it over because it's closer to me than I realize. And then tunnel vision. And again, some of this reduction in my field of vision is due to normal aging. If you've ever approached a parent or a grandparent from the side and you startled them, this may be why, because you thought they could see you, but you were not in their peripheral vision. So those are some of the changes that take place if cognitive impairment is present in the occipital lobe. Let me say something before I go on. These changes that I talk about, they don't all happen necessarily to a person experiencing dementia. And they don't necessarily happen in the same order that I'm going to describe. I want to impress upon you that each case of dementia is as individual as someone's fingerprint. That is based on a lot of reasons. It might be underlying medical conditions. It may be the person's educational or professional background. It may be just their life experiences. So it's what I'm describing are signs and signals that may occur, but not necessarily in every person. And again, they may not occur in the order that I described, and I'll try to highlight some of those examples as we go along. Typically, the occipital lobe is not one of the first areas of the brain to be damaged if dementia is in play, but it may be. The next area that I want to talk about is linguistic processing. Similarly to our eyes, our ears don't do the hearing. Our ears take in auditory data. It's processed in our temporal lobes. The left temporal lobe processes linguistic data, words, and conversation. And the right, we'll get to what the right temporal lobe processes in a minute. Typically, the left temporal lobe is one of the first areas of the brain to be affected if dementia is in play. The left temporal lobe is where we house our vocabulary. It's where we produce speech, in other words, put words together in a meaningful way for others to understand. And it's where we comprehend someone else's speech, where we get meaning out of the words that they've used. So on the left temporal lobe, I've circled here, just as I did with the occipital lobe, but didn't point that out. I've circled the area of the brain that we're talking about. And let me say this too before we go on. This is a very approximate illustration of brain activity. It is not an illustration of the regions of the brain. So if you're looking at my image and saying, well, why did she circle that? It should be bigger, smaller, lower, higher. It's because this is just an approximation. And mainly I'm trying to get you to compare the activity in the healthy brain to that in the early and the middle early and late stages of Alzheimer's and all dementia, frankly. Okay, so the left temporal lobe is where we process linguistic skill, and we typically lose this early on. Left linguistic lose. If we are having problems due to some form of dementia in our left temporal lobe with our linguistic processing, then we will notice that that we have experienced word loss, and typically that shows up with nouns and pronouns rather than verbs or adverbs. For some reason, we don't know that, but we do know that the word loss is typically nouns and pronouns. So if a person, and this is usually would show up, a person losing your name, a loved one's name, that would show up in middle or late dementia. And oftentimes this is very hurtful for family members. It's not that the person no longer loves you or necessarily recognizes you. It's just that your name, they cannot find your name any longer. With this linguistic processing problems, we might also notice a loss in train of thought as we are trying to formulate words or process the words someone else has said so that we can keep up with the conversation. We might notice slower response times. As those synapses become damaged, it takes longer for a person with dementia to process what you and I have said, and then to formulate a response and produce that response. Also, because I hadn't mentioned this, but with linguistic processing, at a certain point in the disease, someone may start losing every third or fourth word that is said. So that can create some misunderstandings. Now I want to talk about the right temporal lobe, which is also involved in auditory processing. And the right temporal lobe is where we tend to process rhythmic and sonic auditory data. So the right temporal lobe is part of rhythmic processing, rhythmic auditory data, and we tend to retain it for a very long period of time. A month ago or so, it was going around on my social media. There was a YouTube video that was posted and shared about an octogenarian ballerina, and she has dementia, and she's sitting kind of slumped down in her wheelchair, and she's not responding to anything around her. She's not speaking to the person who comes up and talks to her. She's really almost catatonic. And then is played for her, so she's a former ballerina, is played for her a classical piece, and I think it's part of Swan Lake. I think it's a selection from Swan Lake. And all of a sudden, you see her kind of wake up and start to move to the music. And this is a beautiful example of how a person, even in late-stage dementia, can respond to rhythmic auditory data. So what does this mean besides the ballerina that I just described? As far as speaking goes, a person can still retain the kind of auditory data that comes from poetry, prayer, and song. You may have heard stories about someone that can't tell you what they just had for lunch a minute ago, but they can recite the Nicene Creed or the Pledge of Allegiance or sing Amazing Grace, or even for that matter, and this is muscle related as well, but they might not be able to tell you what they had for lunch, but if they're a former musician, they can still play that sax solo that they used to play when they were on stage as a younger person. This is the area where we can process and respond to social chit-chat. What is that? You run into someone at the grocery store and you say, "Oh, hey, how are you? I haven't seen you in so long." And the other person says, "I know, I've been so busy and life is just going so fast, isn't it? Yes, I know, I can't believe my children are off to college. Isn't the weather difficult today?" You know, I mean, just like not much meaning in that conversation at all. But we all can respond to social chit-chat. And so there's a rhythm to social chit-chat. And that's why a person can still carry on some forms of conversation that are light and meaningless, even when they can't have maybe a conversation about something that's more abstract. Also, in the right temporal lobe is where we store bad, lewd, and mean words. When I was a child, when I was about 6 years old, I decided to test my mother. And so about 3 times in a brief conversation, I used the word damn. And the third time, she didn't respond the first 2 times, but the third time she responded. And I was grounded for the rest of the weekend. And so I learned as we all do, that bad words are not to be used. So we don't store them with our regular vocabulary, our proper vocabulary in the left lobe. We tuck them over here in the right lobe. And when we lose language in the left lobe, when we use our vocabulary and our ability to put together proper and meaningful sentences, then we only have what's in the right lobe, or less and less we can draw in the left lobe. We draw more and more on the right lobe in order to get by in conversation. So bad words like curse words, lewd words that are maybe sexually charged, mean words, they may be racial slurs, or they may be other things like fatso, idiot, just things that aren't nice to say, that we're taught as a child not to say. Those get retained over here on the right side. So in cognitive decline, when the right temporal lobe is impaired, and we see less red activity over there as we look through the progression of my illustrations here, we might notice a person is using repeated phrases, repetitive phrases. These might be tried and true phrases that are oftentimes not really family jokes, but they're sort of coded with family knowledge, past experiences that a person can draw on still in order to communicate back to you, and family members, caregivers can use in order to help infuse the situation with the meaning that they want the person to comprehend. Misunderstandings can be very common when cognitive impairment affects the left and right temporal lobes. The social chit-chat, so this is a great example. I had a client who was having a conversation with her sister, and she was saying, let's wash your hair. Let's wash your hair. It's your friend is coming over to visit you this afternoon. Let's get you clean, okay? And she gives kind of a thumbs up. Well, social chit-chat. Her sister, the person with dementia, knew that she was being asked a question, and she knew she could either answer yes or no. And then she saw her sister say thumbs up, so she thinks the answer is supposed to be yes. So her sister starts to undress her, goes for her buttons to undress her, and the person with dementia slapped her sister away. The person with dementia knew that she was supposed to answer the question, and she thought she was supposed to say yes, but she had no idea that her sister was telling her, we're going to take a shower, we're going to wash your hair. So misunderstandings are a common sign of cognitive impairment as it relates to our auditory processing skills. Unexpected outbursts. In the example that I just gave, the slapping away of the sister was the unexpected outburst. The caregiver sister thought, all systems go, we can go shower and wash your hair now. And that wasn't what the person with dementia thought at all. And so there was a little outburst. Also inappropriate language. As a person loses their ability to call on, as their vocabulary shrinks, as dementia affects the left temporal lobe, then they only have the words on the right eventually to draw from. And so you may hear inappropriate language that may seem mean and intended, and it's typically not intended, but that's what that person has left to use. The next area I want to talk about is executive processing, and this occurs in our frontal lobe behind our forehead. What is executive processing? It's what executives do, but it's what we all do. This is where we do our critical thinking. It's where we analyze data and weigh consequences of that data and make decisions and formulate plans based on those decisions and sequence tasks to get those plans implemented. It's also where we self-govern. It's where we inhibit ourselves. It's where we hold, from saying fatso to someone and decline to use, that terminology. And it's where we have the ability to feel empathy for others. So when I was talking about the bad words, I believe that those come out in combination between the fact that the good words are no longer available, and also the person has lost the ability to consider the feelings of others. So I shortened this list a little bit over here. Analytical thinking, abstract thinking, sequencing of tasks, and then self-inhibition and empathy there. And if cognitive decline is affecting our frontal lobe, then it's going to show up as problems making decisions and problems planning. Oftentimes, this will show up as a person falls prey to scams because they can't really think logically through all of the cues that they're given that this may be a scam. They don't recognize them anymore. It will show up as problems planning that may have to do with analytical thinking or may have to do with sequencing of tasks. It will create trouble with familiar tasks that does have to do with sequencing. So something like, let's say your mother has always cooked cornbread in an iron skillet in the oven, and she's always throws the ingredients together without measuring cups, doing it from memory. And now she can no longer, she forgets the salt or the baking soda or the lard or what have you, because she's unable to sequence tasks. Also inappropriate behavior, and that has to do with self-inhibition. And a disregard for others' feelings has to do with the loss of the ability to experience empathy, to feel empathy for other people. Generally speaking, these signs would not show up in the early stages of Alzheimer's, generally speaking. But if a person has early stage Alzheimer's, which can show up in 40s or in a person's 40s or 50s, then we may notice this earlier than we would in another person who has dementia or Alzheimer's that shows up in their 60s or 70s or 80s, because it's progressed to that point. I'll also say my father, although he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's at death, which is the way it used to be diagnosed and still sometimes is, I believe the more I read and the more I learn that he had frontotemporal dementia. And this is an area, this is a disease where the frontal lobe is affected very early on, in fact, first, if it's frontotemporal dementia. And I remember things that my father did in his 30s that were signs of his frontotemporal dementia, but because he was so young, no one knew to make that connection. I question now in my book, when my older sister was proofreading my book, and I had mentioned talking about frontotemporal dementia, that the red sports car convertible, that iconic midlife crisis thing that we think of, she said, no, you can't conflate midlife crisis stuff with frontotemporal dementia. And the more I talk to experts in frontotemporal dementia, I wonder if midlife crisis stuff is actually frontotemporal dementia showing up very early on. I don't know, so I wouldn't want you to conflate the red sports car convertible with any form of dementia, but it is a cause for question. Okay, now let's talk about sensory processing. This is really sensory motor function is the cognitive function, but we break it down into two areas, and the first is sensory processing, and then we'll talk about the motor aspects of this. These occur in the parietal lobe, which is roughly, hopefully you can still see my arrows, which is roughly this whole area that sits above the limbic system. We'll talk about that in a minute. The brain, this illustration is two-dimensional. It's not a stacked, where I can show you exactly the lobes of the brain. So this is an approximation, but I'll call it into play using the far left and the far right orange and red areas here within my oval. The parietal lobe sits on top of the limbic system, so it's higher up in the skull. For sensory processing, the skills are knowing where one's body is in relation to the space around them, being able to interpret sensation from the body, and also our motor planning, or preparing to move, occurs in the sensory processing region of the brain. When there is decline, and you'll notice as you look through the red rectangle here, how there is a difference in the changes in this area of the brain. There is a change in activity in this area of the brain. When we lose the ability to detect our body, to know how to place our body in space, that may show up as clumsiness. That may show up as interpreting sensation from the body. When that changes, we might misinterpret touch. If the stroking of someone's arm, the gentle stroking of someone's arm is something that you feel should be soothing to them, but dementia's in play, that may feel like bugs or snakes to them. Also, breezes over the skin may feel like bugs or snakes or just be unwelcome. So oftentimes you may think that you're touching someone in a comforting way, but it is troubling to to the other person because their ability to process sensation has been jumbled. So sensation from the body is going to include touch and taste and smell. Interestingly, smell lingers long in age, even in dementia. And there's one of the self-preservation reasons for that has to do with the limbic system, and the olfactory glands are right next to the limbic system. But food preferences, talking about tactile, we talked about that. Let's talk about taste. A person's ability to process sweet tastes is retained a lot longer than a person's ability to process savory tastes if cognitive impairment is in play, if dementia is in play. And we often see in folks with Alzheimer's that they gravitate towards sweet foods the more the progression unfolds. My father's go-to was Moose Tracks ice cream. Some people enjoy cookies, candy bars, and other junks. But for him it was ice cream, and this is very normal because the person doesn't enjoy savory foods any longer or as much because they can't process it as well. Voluntary motion is the other part of our sensory motor function, and so it's not that one of these is left and one of these is right. They both happen in the same region of the brain. In this particular slice of the positron positron emission tomography, we are not really seeing the sensory motor, the parietal lobe, as well as if we took a higher slice in the brain, but it is generally in this region. Our cognitive skill related to motor function is responding to sensory stimuli with motion. If somebody throws me a ball, I'm going to catch it. That's because my parietal lobe is working. It's also because my occipital lobe is working, so I can detect that motion and detect that form and actually catch it. This is the area of the brain that governs our hand-eye coordination, our gross motor skills, and our fine motor skills. And so if there's a problem in this area, we might notice mumbling or poor enunciation as dementia progresses. That's very common. Illegible handwriting, whereas our handwriting changes as we age to some degree, a pronounced change where it becomes difficult even for loved ones to interpret someone's handwriting. Trouble with fasteners, like, for example, shoelaces, zippers, buttons, snaps, hooks and eyes. And so it's, if a person is having problems in that area, it's advised that caretakers look for elasticized clothing and Velcro closures on shoes and pants flies and that kind of thing. Also, shuffling while walking. Our gait will change normally as we age, but pronounced shuffling is usually a signal of cognitive impairment. And the last areas I want to talk about are new learning and memory, and also our survival instincts. And both of these are in the limbic system. So the new learning and memory we'll talk about first. The limbic system is housed in the medial temporal lobe. And the limbic system includes the hippocampus and the amygdala. When we're talking about new learning and new memory, we're talking about the hippocampus. And these are not left or right, by the way, so I don't know why I'm doing this. To point it out to you in the little circle I've drawn, I would consider these, for our purposes today, let's consider the hippocampus to be reflective of these kind of parentheses that are surrounding these two red dots that are also in this circle that I've drawn. So we're talking about these parentheses areas right now. New learning and new memory. This is where so the limbic system is in charge of our survival. It's our self-preservation. And so for the hippocampus, the new learning and new memory area of the limbic system, we are really talking about survival by intentional adaptation. So we are surviving because we are forming new memories and new learning. We have immediate recall is in the hippocampus. We are able to store memories. We have control over our stored memories in this area. And also we have a sense of time and place. In the case of Alzheimer's, the hippocampus, our new memory and new learning skills are typically some of the first that are damaged when dementia is in play. So it's normal that one might see missing appointments, forgetfulness will show up as a potential sign of cognitive impairment. However, forgetfulness is something that kind of happens to seniors normally. So is it normal senior aging, or are these the earliest signs of dementia? Hopefully my conversation will help you separate that. When our hippocampus is impaired by dementia, we will lose the ability to adapt to change. We will have problems following directions and also wayfinding. Not only directions, how do you do something, but how do you get somewhere. We will have problems retaining new data. We will ask repetitive questions because we can't remember that we just asked that question or what the answer was. When are we going to the dentist? When are we going to the dentist? When are we going to the dentist? When those questions happen, it's because it's not that the person's trying to annoy their caregiver or their loved one. They genuinely cannot remember that question was just answered. Also misplacing things. I just set down my telephone. Now, oh, where's my telephone? Where's my telephone? You and I can think back and say, well, when I put it down or when I last used it, I was in the kitchen, so let me try there. And sure enough, there's our telephone sitting on the kitchen counter. A person who has a damaged hippocampus due to cognitive impairment or decline will not be able to retrace their steps and locate their phone until it rings. So these are some of the problems that are associated with damage to the hippocampus. The amygdala is in charge of our survival instincts, and this is survival not by adaptation, as in the hippocampus, but in the amygdala, survival by defense. So this is really our fight or flight mechanisms, or really come from the amygdala. And there, for purposes of our conversation, let's consider that those are these two red dots that kind of look like eyes above that purple nose there in this illustration. So survival by defense, that is detecting and responding to threats around us to literally keep us alive. It's also, interestingly, where we form emotions. There's a lot of emotions surrounding threats to our existence. And there's a lot of emotions surrounding pleasure. This is also an area where we experience pleasure. Yeah, this is the area where we experience pleasure. When there is damage to the amygdala, let me point out, this is so interesting to me. So we look at the two red dots in the healthy brain, and we notice when we go over to the early stages of dementia that those areas seem to be bigger. And we notice that they don't seem to lose nearly as much skill as all of the other areas of the brain in the late stage of dementia. This is part of creation or evolution. It's in order to survive, we need to have these survival instincts. As a person is losing their ability to process visual cues around them and auditory cues around them and tactile cues around them, they will naturally realize that they have less ability to detect threat around them and to respond to it. So it's going to create a heightened sense of urgency. It can create sort of a base level of anxiety. You know, the person is chronically anxious, not just acutely anxious, but anxious all the time, because they can no longer process the world around them the way that they once did. Also, I talked about this being the pleasure-seeking area of the brain. If it is damaged, we will see an inability to delay gratification. I want it now, now, now. You know, is a signal that may reveal the cognitive decline. Although typically that would show up a little later on. Distrust, paranoia, and delusions. You know, I've talked about the fact that we're not processing other data, sensory data around us as we once were, and it tends to make someone, again, with a heightened sense of anxiety, to easily jump to distrust and paranoia and delusions. My father, one day I walked into his room, he misplaced his wallet, and he couldn't remember where he put it because his new learning area was damaged. And because it was his wallet and his money and his independence and control and power over the world, he accused me of stealing his wallet. Well, I was just, you know, the innocent bystander, but I was the convenient target for this. So distrust and paranoia are very common And delusions. I didn't steal his wallet. These are very common emotions that go along with dementia as it progresses. Overreaction. My father's accusation was an overreaction. And aggression, agitation, and combativeness. It's all tied to the fact that someone feels threatened, generally speaking, and they are using whatever is left in order to help preserve their own existence. So now I would like to move to how to use the DIY assessment. And the DIY assessment is, oh dear, I forgot to put that in the chat. I promised, I told myself to remember to do that and I forgot. So I'll ask Alan to forward that to all attendees afterwards. My email address and the URL, the link where you can take the DIY assessment. It is in SurveyMonkey. You do not have to give me your email in order to take the assessment. You can find the assessment on my webpage, but if you access it from my webpage, it would require your email address. So that's why I encourage you to use this link, which is surveymonkey.com, and then there's this weird /r and then signals assessment. But Alan will provide that. I see she's trying to type it now into the chat. So thank you, Alan. I appreciate that. Again, it doesn't require your email address, so it's free and anonymous. It takes most people 7 to 10 minutes to complete, assuming that you have, 7 to 10 uninterrupted minutes. Don't overthink it. Just kind of go with your gut feeling at that moment. I will show you in a moment what the first question looks like in there, and all of the questions follow the same format. There are 30 questions. So it shows you all of the signals that we talked about, everything that was listed on the right-hand column when we were talking about cognitive decline for all of those 8 areas of the brain make up the 30 questions. So you shouldn't notice anything in the survey that we haven't already talked about. There are 3 questions for each of the potential signals. There's 30 potential signals question, and there's 3 questions per each, and I'll show you what they look like in a minute. And they go back to what I was describing in the beginning. Is it unusual and not like before for that person? So different from before, different for that person. Is it more than just a senior moment? Do they have the ability to recover from that, lapse, let's say, or not? If they can recover, then it's really just a senior moment. Does it interrupt the flow of daily living? Here's an example of the first question. Regarding problems with object or facial recognition, what I've noticed, and then you'll complete each of these statements, each of these statements is the end of what I've noticed, and then you will check does not apply, seldom applies, often applies, or usually applies. And then SurveyMonkey will score that for you, and it will give you a brief recommendation based on your score range at the end of it. So for this one, with object or facial recognition, what I've noticed is unusual and not like before. Does that not apply? Does it usually apply, or somewhere in the middle? Is what I've noticed more than just a senior moment? Is what I've noticed something that interrupts the flow of daily living? So all of the questions, or all of the signals, are probed in this very same way. So as you can see, it's not difficult to complete the assessment. And again, don't overthink it. Just go with your gut reaction, what your first inclination is. And now the rest of our conversation, these other 2 topics are very brief. Establishing a cognitive baseline. Every person who is 65 plus is supposed to receive a cognitive screening by your primary care physician during your annual visit. I say supposed to. Research shows that not all primary care physicians will ask this question. So if you're not asked for a cognitive screening, ask your primary care physician. Insurance covers this. It is easier to detect cognitive changes when you can compare current results to before. So if your doctor says, well, are you noticing any problems? You might say, no, not now, but I want to establish a cognitive baseline, a snapshot of before, in case when I come back next year, I do notice something different. So it'll be easier to know if something's changed if we have this cognitive baseline. And if your primary care physician continues to resist, there are other ways to get this cognitive screening. See how fast that topic was? And now seeking medical advice. I would like to stress that there are other medical conditions that, that elicit symptoms that look like the symptoms that we've talked about for dementia. The most common of those is depression, but also excessive alcohol consumption, vitamin deficiencies, hypothyroidism, unremitting pain, interactions between medications that a person may be taking, and then hearing loss. My mother has hearing loss. It's not dementia, but it kind of shows up like dementia sometimes for us, and also vision loss. If you are noticing these changes that we've talked about today, it's not a foregone conclusion that you have cognitive impairment. It may be some other condition that may be treatable. So if you notice these signs in yourself or someone else, I always encourage my clients to approach this as if it is a treatable medical condition. And if it is treatable, then we should go get it checked out. So we're seeking medical advice, not let's get a medical opinion, because a medical opinion sounds like a second opinion, which sounds a lot like a diagnosis to a lot of people. So we're just seeking medical advice to understand what this is so we can treat it. If we go to the eye doctor and the audiologist and that's not the problem, then we can still rule out some other things. So the normal course of a diagnostic path might look like this. It starts with the primary care physician, who may refer you on to the eye doctor or a hearing doctor, or to have you screened for depression. You might end up seeing a gerontologist or a neurologist or a psychoneurologist along the way. But really, we're seeking, our MO, our modus operandi, is to seek a medical condition that we can treat. Let's not go to the dark place that it's automatically dementia. That's not, it's not good for anyone's psyche to approach it that way, because it may very well not be dementia. And now we have just a couple minutes for questions. Here again is my email and that link URL. And if any one of you has a question, I hope, or maybe you've typed it in the chat, I hope you'll share it with me and we can answer it in this wider group.
Thank you so much. This was really, really informative and interesting. I mean, you've done such a good job contextualizing and grounding in the physiology what we may be experiencing ourselves or have seen in others. So creating a little bit more of an embodied experience about it actually helps. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
Yeah. Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
I have a concern because my mother recently died, and my father is in the early stages of Alzheimer's, living by himself, and independent living in a continuing care community. So there's a progression up if he needs it and recognizes it. So he's out of state. And I'm wondering, are there certain behaviors that I should look for that will help, certain key things in his life, like taking away his car keys, recognizing when he should not perform the financial stuff that he does, paying bills and stuff, maybe giving money to the wrong people, when he will need to go to a memory care facility as opposed to independent living. Are there certain benchmark behaviors to look for that might signal when certain changes like that are needed?
Well, thank you for the question, Robert. I heard you ask about, are there certain triggers that when I know that it's time to take away the keys, or to manage the financials myself, or to decide that it's time for him to move to the memory care unit within his continuous care community right now. Everyone is different. However, with regard to the keys, if you are noticing problems with depth perception, or you're noticing that he is not detecting motion, or so that might be throwing a Nerf ball with him to see how he responds to that, to see if he can catch it, to notice if he reaches for his coffee cup, does he grab it or does he fumble around? Also colors, does he notice a red object against a green background or a red object against a gray background, then those might be signals. If the answer to those is no, or he's not doing it very well, then it may be time to limit or for him to cease driving. The tried and true paths, my mother, she doesn't have dementia, but she's 87. And so, all of her, thinking skills are processing slower. We like for her to go, it's okay for her to go to the grocery store, the post office, the vet for her dog, and to her stitching group, because those are, the beaten path. So oftentimes, maybe the first step is the beaten path kind of driving can still happen, but look for those visual cues that I talked about, the particularly depth perception and the ability to detect motion. And it might be not just detecting motion, but responding to motion quickly enough, because as you know, when we drive, we need to be thinking on our feet. Anything can happen in any moment, and we have to respond in a split second. With regard to the financials, that's such a tricky area, because even seniors without dementia fall prey to financial scams. They just don't recognize them like you or I do, because scams are very sophisticated these days. So I would, without knowing your father and without knowing more about the situation, I would be working to begin that changeover to you in the near future, just in general, dementia or not. Maybe not all of the finances, but maybe the stock portfolio, or something like that. With regard to whether or not it's time for him to move to memory care, if he can no longer function independently, then it's time for memory care. If he is having, if there are frequent, well, it's not as strong as what I just said. If he's no longer functioning independently, then memory care may be a next step, but I would be hesitant to move to memory care without some kind of cognitive assessment with some kind of professional. If he is disturbing other residents, then that's maybe a time for cognitive assessment. That it has to do with that loss of empathy that we talked about, that would signal that cognitive impairment, may be the case. And those are the three that I remember you're asking. Does that cover what you're curious about?
Yeah, you're answering my question very well. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
It's difficult because I don't know your father and I've not observed him, but hopefully this will give you more information to help process and make your decisions with.
That's a big help. I think I'll play catch with him once in a while.
Okay.
Anyone else? Hi, I wish I had any questions, but I don't, but I really enjoyed your talk.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I live with my 94-year-old mother who has had dementia and Alzheimer's for about 8 years. And so far, so good. But all of those things that you said are all exactly what's happening.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm sorry to hear that.
It's really interesting to almost everything you touched on was something that she's been dealing with. Like the repetitiveness, she's got certain stories she tells over and over again. It's almost like as soon as she gets to the end of the story, sometimes it'll just start again, And
Much
she'll
add to that.
Like I didn't know my father or something, like stories that I'm like, yes, of course I know. But that I already know about and have heard many times. But she also will do the catchphrases. She says, "Oh boy," for everything. So it's very interesting that now I can see that, yes, it's like, this is just what happens.
What's happening, and now understanding what's under the hood that's causing these things.
Yes.
I have a recent blog that I published it about a week ago on my website about the stories. It's actually, it pairs with another blog that I published, I think in November or December, about the repetitive stories and how it takes so much cognitive skill for us to carry on a conversation. We have to process the words that someone has said to us. We have to contemplate our response, which is going to call on our memories and our knowledge of facts and our emotions, in 3 different areas of the brain. Then we have to go back to our linguistic skills in the left temporal lobe and formulate a response and get those words together and then get them out. And so that's very tiring for elderly people in general, as peak working memory declines. And for a person with dementia, it's even more challenging and frustrating. But the old memories seem to stay, don't they? A person, because those old memories are so closely tied to that person's identity. And we are all the best subject matter experts on ourselves, rather than what's on the television or what's happening in the news. This is closest to home for us. And I believe in my father's case, like, he wouldn't let you get a word in edgewise, to say, yes, you've told me already, and then the story would start over again. And it's because that was his attempt at communicating, at conversation. He was using what he could use, what was available to him, to engage with me socially. And in the blog, I talk about inspiring curiosity, ask for details. How did it feel when so-and-so said that to you? Or how did it feel when you graduated? Ask for the feelings surrounding the events that she's talking about. Okay. Because emotions, that's one more thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up about that. As dementia progresses, logic declines. My mother would say, logic does not apply, but emotions increase. And so when you're talking about emotions, that's something a person with dementia can really respond to. So, or ask for details. Sometimes, like if the person, my father had a blue muscle car convertible that he, bought with his hard-earned high school money. If the person, has worked that hard for something that's part of their identity, well, what color blue was it? And they can tell you. And emotions, everyone is always, emotions are never wrong. And so when you ask those kinds of questions, you give the person the chance to be, your mother, to be correct, to be the subject matter expert. So endure them and make them more interesting for yourself by asking for details.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. But yeah, this has been great. Thank you for doing this, Alan.
Oh,
Cloud, yes.
This has been great. I have one final question, actually. It's not really a question, but just thinking back, someone like me, 40, 40s and 50s, trying not to go to a dark place when we see ourselves in the slides. What should our age group do? I mean, we should be thinking, oh my gosh, this is a precursor to something later, or, I know I've read a lot about how chronic stress and sleep apnea and like certain things like that can mimic some of these or create some of these issues with the brain, and they're temporary. So how do we start to parse that out? What recommendations do you have for anybody so we don't start foreseeing a dark future, but just prepare ourselves and take action now that we can help ourselves with?
Oh, I'm so glad for that question. You and your 40s are at or approaching the peak of your career. So you're doing a lot of multitasking, and the kinds of work that you're doing calls on as much of your cognitive thinking skills as possible, and you have a great deal of responsibility, a great deal that you're responsible for. That causes a lot of stress. So what you are, these are probably what you're observing are more like senior moments, even though you're not yet senior, that have to do with everything that's coming at you all at once that you're thinking about. And so what can you do, the other part of your question, what can you do to try to head this off at the pass, to make sure it doesn't go dark on you? Yes, get a good night's sleep as often as possible. If you can't maintain the same sleeping and waking schedule, which is advised, for some reason I can't explain it to you, but I've read it from authoritative sources, the wake-up time, keeping that regular, is more important than the sleep time. Drink a lot of water. Water purges toxins from the body and the brain. Sleep purges toxins from the brain. Eat a heart-healthy diet. A heart-healthy diet is a brain-healthy diet. It has to do with our circulatory system and the ability of our circulatory system to deliver blood and oxygen to the brain for it to function correctly. If you smoke, stop. If you drink alcohol, you know, you may have heard that a glass or two of red wine is actually good because of all the antioxidants in it. That's true. But the third glass of wine is probably not so good. Even though it may taste good, or you may deserve it, it's probably not so good. So limit, you don't have to stop drinking, but limit your alcohol consumption. Salt. Salt, we know that salt encourages the buildup of plaque in our circulatory system that can inhibit our ability to deliver blood to the brain. And so a low sodium diet is important for that reason. My family doesn't have heart problems or circulatory problems, so I thought I was free and clear until I read research that shows that salt triggers an immune response in our brain that can be damaging. So, I mean, I love the savory stuff, not the sweet stuff, and I'm really sad, but I have to limit my salt so that I don't, you know, so that I don't end up in a dark place too. What else? Exercise, regular exercise, 30 minutes 5 times a week. It doesn't have to be more vigorous than walking, but regular exercise. Also social engagement. When we are with others and we're talking, we're calling on so many cognitive skills. So social engagement is actually cognitive exercise, and also problem solving. So that might be crossword puzzles, or it might be Pictionary, or charades, or Sudoku, or however you say that. But also adding to that problem solving that's involved with new learning. It doesn't necessarily mean formal education, although a lot of people, you read a lot of advice along those lines. I would back off from that. You know, learn a musical instrument, take up a new language. Well, I mean, you're in the peak of your career. You don't have time for that if you don't already know a musical instrument or haven't taken, you know, French 101. It doesn't have to be that daunting. It could be taking on a new hobby and taking a class in that, or taking a class that advances your skills in a hobby you already enjoy. Any kind of learning of new information where you have to apply and demonstrate that you've retained and know how to use that information, I would call formal learning. So keep up with your friends, keep up with your with healthy eating, keep up with your exercise, keep up with brain stimulation.
Okay, perfect.
And yeah.
Dancing and just, you know, letting off some of that stress, you know.
Yes, you know, dancing calls on, so running, okay, that's calling on my motor skills, but it's not really calling on my thinking skills in the same way that dancing does. So think about the activities that require coordinated movement when you're thinking about exercise. Tennis, you know, basketball, that kind of thing. Yeah, coordinated movement. And also, remember the list I showed you, that long list of things that could look like it could be dementia? It's probably not dementia.
One too many times I've left my phone or wallet on the top of my car.
Alan, don't worry. You're fine.
Because you had other things on your mind.
I know I'm not alone. But, yeah, this is very practical advice. And yeah, thank you so much for all of this information, and it will live on, and hopefully others will be able to enjoy this and benefit from it. I know this is not always the most pleasant things to talk about, but thanks for making it a little more pleasant and a little more empowering us with more information and knowledge to help us make good choices and have our loved ones and gain that insight that we need to move forward. So thank you so much for being here.
I am so honored that you asked me, and it has been such a privilege, and you all have been so great. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you on June 7th at noon.
June 7th and July 12th, so 2 more. But yeah, you're wonderful. We love partnering with you, so fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Great to see you all.